Welcome to the Forward Together webinar series, brought to you by the School of Management at California Lutheran University. The series is designed to bring interesting topics and people to our global community of students, alumni, and leaders in business and government to empower, educate, and inspire. Forward Together features experts from industry with the purpose to spark thought, connect people, and stimulate engaging discussions. Please submit your questions in the chat. We will hold a Q&A immediately following the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody from Thousand Oaks, California. My name is Gerhard Apfelthaler. Welcome and a Happy New Year wherever you are. We have a very exciting program for you today in our Forward Together webinar series. We have Kevin Bumen, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at San Francisco International Airport. Prior to his current role, Kevin was Director of Airports for San Luis Obispo County and Director of Aviation at Truckee Tahoe Airport District. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of Airports Council International and on the board of the American Association of Airport Executives. And if I'm not completely wrong, I think he's also a pilot himself. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Welcome, Kevin. How's the weather up in San Francisco?
It's a beautiful day. The sun is starting to shine here in San Francisco. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Can everyone see me and hear me okay? Are we good? Excellent.
We can hear you perfectly. Thanks for being with us, Kevin.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. And it goes without saying in a most unusual time, which we will be talking about today, and how the events of COVID-19 have dramatically impacted the aviation industry and the operation of San Francisco International Airport. A bit of context before we begin. Appreciate the highlights of my background. I've been in the industry now almost 18 years, and of course the events throughout the recent history of aviation, or the long history of aviation, as we'll talk about, have really never experienced a shock like we're encountering at the moment. Another important note of context, I think, before we start too, is just a little bit about the world of airports that may help lend some understanding to the discussion. San Francisco it's a publicly owned, publicly operated airport. It's owned by the city and county of San Francisco. That is typical of many airports within the US. They're going to be owned by a city or a county, sometimes a port authority, and typically operated by the public entity. Globally, you see more of a hybrid model where you have some element of public and private ownership, and typically private operations. So nonetheless, we all serve the same customer, the traveling public, and the commercial airlines that serve both domestic and international markets. So with that, as we step into the impact of the event, and Susan, I am trying to advance the slide. There we go. Thank you. So as we look at this event, it's dramatic in many ways, and as I'm sure you've seen and read in much of the media, that air travel and tourism has been dramatically impacted. I think this single chart here says it all for what our airport has experienced in the last year in terms of drop off of passengers, where we're down as much as 25% right now. And looking back at as things were starting to recover a bit in the late summer, we were seeing some improvement, but nonetheless, it's a long duration event, and I think that is perhaps one of the most unusual characteristics to it. As we look at this in a historical context for this airport, it gets very interesting when you think about events of the past and their influence on the airport. Nothing has had the duration of this event in terms of month after month after month of a perpetual factor that is suppressing our traffic. You look at economic recessions, you look at 9/11, you look at previous epidemic events that were perhaps more regional in nature, or never proved to be a global scale event of what we have now. And the shock to the system was, while immediate, it was a much different shape of recovery. And 9/11 here was a extremely impactful event, but there was a steady path of recovery that we have not seen yet. So our industry is challenged both with the immediate magnitude of the event, but also charting the path forward. How do we take something that is unprecedented in its context, in its magnitude, and both manage for the now, but also plan for the future? And that's a question that many in our industry collectively, both the airlines and the airports, are really trying to find a way through that. So we have done several things here. I've only been in San Francisco about 3 months, and so the work that I've stepped into here has been very impressive in the level of thoughtfulness and planning that the team has put in place to deal with the immediate crisis and this longer term view of the future. It's been manifested in a recovery to resiliency plan. And this document was built as a 3-year micro-strategic plan that sat independent of our broader 5-year strategy, but as a supporting document to that, to really bring forward the immediate issues of the pandemic and how we were going to attempt to recover back onto that lane of our traditional strategic plan. It goes without saying that the revenue loss that has accompanied the loss in passengers has been dramatic across all our lines of business. The airport world as an element of government is unique in that, unlike many services the government provides that are funded through taxpayer support or other revenue sources from other governments, we're enterprise government, meaning that we generate revenue through the operation of the facility, through rates and charges and leases and fees, and then that becomes our operating budget. So we have a different construct than most other divisions of government, and so revenue loss is something that is deeply troubling when we look at our planning for the future. The final note is the composition of travel. As we've seen this die off, it's been dramatic in terms of its totality, but when you look at the business leisure split, those that are traveling today are most likely to be traveling for leisure. And as we think about recovery, that is going to be the first passenger back, and for some time to come, an expected volume of traffic in leisure that's going to far outweigh business. For the airlines, that's a little bit concerning because a business traveler is a very different customer economically. Higher spend rates, very different pattern of booking. And so for future health of the airline business, the recovery of business travel is going to be an extremely important part of that. So to put San Francisco in context, we're a big airport by most measures, and not just big in the domestic world, but on a global stage. And so we work as part of the airport benchmarking group, 9 global hubs of similar size and characteristics, serving both as a domestic hub as well as an international gateway hub. And as we're collaborating around issues of operational need or financial recovery, these are the airports that we're consistently in contact with about many of these issues. So back to this recovery to resiliency plan. It was a foundational document that was created over the summer of 2020. And it really laid out these goals around the passenger experience at the airport, the financial stability of the airport, and supporting the businesses at the airport. We quickly realized in this, when I was in San Luis Obispo as well as San Francisco, in that if you don't keep the business environment at the airport healthy during this event, and businesses are failing, particularly for things that the airport has some discretion over, we're not performing at the highest level. So the financial recovery was seen as something greater than just the health of the airport itself, but the health of our business partners, and how could we work collaboratively with them to ensure that recovery occurred equitably across the organization, but also in a way that builds in sustainability as we go forward. And then that idea of resiliency on the back end of this. We have continually thought through this idea of things that we can take from this event and try and build into a desired future state. I will say it's maybe a bit too soon to see the permanence of those, but it is a topic that comes up frequently as to how well something may have worked at this point, and does it have a place in our future here at the airport. So San Francisco was the first airport in the country to do a couple of things during the pandemic. We were the first airport to formalize a mask wearing policy and make it a requirement for anyone entering the airport. And this came in coordination, but in advance of the airlines developing their mask requirements for boarding an aircraft and having a mask as part of that process. The other thing we were a leader in was COVID-19 testing. And the airport was uniquely positioned to advance this because we're one of the few airports in the world that has a full-scale medical clinic in the airport. It's actually in our international terminal on the departures level. And it is run by Dignity Health. It's part of the St. Mary's Hospital here on the peninsula. And we had a lot of the infrastructure in place to build that out to a testing site. And so the team began work on that soon after the event began. And it really allowed the airport to start to build around this vision of there will be an element of testing required, perhaps for something like international travel, or perhaps for markets like Hawaii. And those were very speculative at the time, but as of today, with the CDC's announcement, international travel has a testing requirement associated with it, and Hawaii reopened the islands to tourism with a testing requirement. That allowed the airport to be very well positioned for receiving flights in those markets, or in this case, supporting international operations going forward. Yes, people can test off-site to travel, but in some cases, testing on airport makes a tremendous difference for how that process can work for someone, i.e. flight crews that may need to test immediately before flying. So as I mentioned, the process began in the spring. There was determination of interest. There was a lot of work done around the role that Dignity Health would play in this and the Go Health model for urgent care, contract development, and then it was launched in July with flight crew testing as a basically a small group that we could know was predictably going to use the facility. And it was operated with tenant employees through October. So we had a few months of operation using this for internal purposes. And then when I arrived in October, it opened to passenger testing with a reservation system associated with it to manage flows. And it's proven to be very successful for us on many fronts. It's given us some flexibility around the use of the asset for flight crew testing on certain markets that need that. If we have tenant issues here within the terminal related to COVID, we can get testing right away. And so now as we move forward in time, we're looking at both scaling of that site as well as adding PCR testing within this operation. The other piece that developed in parallel with this is United Airlines developed a separate site out on property they lease on the airport for a drive-through testing facility. So we have 2 testing sites on airport today. This is what it looks like. It's a pretty basic build. We used existing space, both indoor and outdoor space, on what's called a courtyard level in our international terminal. That is a surface level that has both parking nearby and drive-up area available. There's some initial registration work done in one area. They go back into a waiting area outside. The testing is actually done outdoors, and then the tests are processed indoors here, as you can see at the 6 machines that we have on site. This is a rapid test. I won't go too far into the different types of COVID testing, but they are different. They have different pros and cons and different efficacies. But this was seen as the most effective way to get COVID testing on the airport. A lot of challenges in this. Immediately you've got an airport that had a healthcare operation here that operated under its own premises and construct, and suddenly we're in partnership with a healthcare testing facility, and really looking through many of the challenges that became readily apparent, and how we would prioritize employees versus passengers, payments, the kind of ever-changing world around guidance related to COVID testing, the needs of the airlines that were ever evolving. And then positive cases. I will point out that positive case management was a distinct challenge, because as COVID testing sites began to evolve in all venues, not just airports, it became known that the standardization of how a positive case was being handled was not there. And so we had to work closely with local health authorities and the CDC to build out our positive case management plan in a way that if we had someone who tested positive, could they be denied boarding on an aircraft after that? There was little guidance at that time around issues of positive case management as they related to air travel. So very much an evolutionary process, and a lot was learned along the way. There are COVID testing sites now at many airports around the country. I think their relevancy, given the CDC guidance today, will be increasingly important, particularly as we ideally see some border reopenings in conjunction with testing, and ultimately see that we have a site on airport that, oh, I'm sorry, we just went really fast there. As we see the air travel markets reopen, particularly on the international front, and we have passengers from foreign countries who will not be a part of the U.S. health system, that will need to test to return to their home country, and that they can essentially walk in with a reservation, unaffiliated with the U.S. health system, and obtain a test. So a lot of work to go now in evolving our COVID testing here on site, and ensuring that it meets the demands of the future, both in terms of the types of testing as well as the scale of the testing that we have. So thinking about what's next, I highlight here one of the goals from our recovery to resiliency plan. And as we think about the financial aspects of this, it's daunting, and daunting in many ways, because as we really break down the composition of what's happening here operationally, we're seeing a reasonably normal volume of flight operations during certain periods of time that have a lot of empty seats on the airplane. Bottom line, the airlines are flying flights at minimum load factors for various reasons. Sometimes the flight pays for itself on the belly cargo. Sometimes it's a strategic route that they need to maintain a position on. In other cases, the route has sporadic demand, so they're keeping it online. But in any cases, we're seeing our facility and the flight operations tempo at more normal levels. I was looking at some reports that in summary were showing that we're using about 95% of our physical assets here on the campus in terms of gates and ramp space and parking for aircraft, doing as much as 80% of our normal activity, but moving on a good day about 25% of the passengers. And so with that comes a cost structure that is based really on the scale of the facility and the operational tempo, but not on the revenue it's generating. And so that is going to be a significant challenge as we work our way out of this, because for a short period of time, like many organizations, an airport can survive on reserves and other strategies around refinancings and other mechanisms that have good purpose, but limited durability in this. And as we think about some of the longer term questions of this, primarily, what level of recovery will traffic return to? Imagine if our traffic only comes back to 60, 70, even 80% of pre-pandemic levels, we still don't have a financially viable operation here. So we have been doing a tremendous amount of cost cutting, contract renegotiations, all of the things you would expect in really trying to bring our expenses in line with our revenues. In a government domain, that is not nearly as easy or as elegant as I would like it to be. We operate with many of the constructs of government, which are very deliberate in the pace at which you can move things, and we're in a time when it couldn't be more important than ever to need to do things somewhat quickly. Our capital plan has some challenges going forward. We have been working under incremental 6-month delays around some of our major capital components here. We have work still in progress in areas, but we also have work in suspension. As far as vaccinations go, we are in the process right now of coordinating 4 on-site vaccinations with the surrounding county, as well as looking at the needs for our workforce here on the airport of almost 50,000 employees. That we're the largest employer on the peninsula right now, and really have a large workforce that will need vaccination in the Tier 1B group. So if California sticks to that plan, we're going to have a lot of folks that will become eligible under that transportation worker sector. Airbridge development. So this was a concept that that was evolving with our testing, and of course with CDC guidance forthcoming now. Air bridges are kind of almost by default in place. And the idea of an air bridge is if you have a tested flight on both directions, you have this presumably sterile bridge that can transfer people between 2 countries and limit the transfer of COVID to a near zero level or within the limits of the testing. We have pioneered that concept on many fronts. We've advocated for it at the international and federal levels. We are pleased to see the CDC requirements come out as stated, because it furthers the ability for the evolution of international travel during the event. We talked a bit about the expansion of COVID testing capacity. That will result likely in more providers here, and of course more volume that we could use COVID testing to sustain an increase in capacity here at the airport. And then finally, operational recovery. I think this is an interesting one too. It comes under this premise of, we have, like many businesses, as the duration of the event has extended, we have taken certain assets offline. We've put equipment into storage. We've got people doing other things than they normally do, and so bringing all of that back to life creates challenges of its own. And of course, how quickly we could do that if we start to see a rapid upturn in passenger demand. We could only hope, I guess, to have that problem, but at the same time, the speed at which recovery occurs could be just as problematic in some cases. So we're trying to not lose sight of the fact that, as you saw in the very first chart, this has been a very slow recovery and a long duration, that if we see a rapid return, that we have a new set of challenges at hand to deal with at that point. So that concludes my comments. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Looks like your first 90 or 100 days at SFO weren't too boring, right?
May we live in interesting times. I believe it is interesting. To talk just a bit about that, transitioning, organizations and communities during a pandemic is something that I don't know that anyone would plan for or hope for. Opportunities do happen, and like many things, we need to seize them when they do happen. And so this transition has been most unusual, as a professional and a personal transition, in that the virtual world of working in this way and adapting into a large organization is not necessarily any easier with this.
I can only imagine. Kevin, we have a number of questions in the Q&A. I'd like to get the ones that are very specific maybe to your presentation out of the way first. So there's a question about how San Francisco International Airport is charging for the rapid testing.
So there is insurance that is accepted there. We have a reservation process. One of the things we learned, so the insurance is billed, and in some cases, the employers, if it's employee testing, they set up an account directly with the provider. But the thing we've learned through the reservations is that what we were seeing for bookings, and then for an arrival rate, we were seeing quite a few people who would make a reservation initially and then wouldn't show up. And so we were holding capacity for no-shows. And so we are adapting that to having a prepayment portion of that to ensure the reservation, and really try and make sure we don't end up with capacity that goes unutilized in that.
Right, that makes sense. Do your systems in some way tie in with the reservation systems of airlines?
They don't, and that that is one of the fundamental challenges at airports of all sizes, in that the airport is the facility operator, and the airline, from an IT standpoint, are often very disconnected in terms of managing who the passenger is, and understanding elements, both pre-travel and during the passenger's time at the airport. We have made some progress in that case, but the COVID testing process is independent of that right now. If someone is booking, they will see that there is COVID testing as an option. Some of the airlines do offer that as an informative item during the booking process, that San Francisco has that, others don't. We have 44 airlines here at the airport. Of that, 16 are not flying right now, but we have almost 30 airlines flying right now. So they all handle that piece a little bit differently, whether it's relevant to their market or not.
And do you foresee that vaccinations will become mandatory at some point for international travel?
Too soon to tell. I think it's possible. This idea that the International Air Transportation Association has been promulgating is around this idea of a health passport of sorts, that the vaccination could lead to that, and of course then the integration of how your health credential would be stored and presented, through a digital format. All sorts of possibilities out there. And is it checked upon departure, upon arrival? How would the international community standardize around that? There's a lot of process and control questions that are being worked through. Ultimately, it's going to come down to, is it a requirement? And as we've seen, the CDC took some time on the testing question. Vaccinations are being contemplated in the same sense right now.
I have another very specific question regarding your operations currently. Do you enforce mask wearing on airport premises?
We do. Yes, we do actively. Signage, digital PA announcements. We have a group of Travel Well ambassadors that are trained staff that are working as meeters and greeters in the airport, but they are carrying around in their vests masks. And if someone does not have a mask, they're offered a mask. They are requested to put one on if they don't. If they refuse, there is a warning notice issued. And if there were a case of a repeat offender, and I don't know that we've had one, but the local ordinances here do allow a citation for not wearing a mask. We haven't gone to that level yet, but we're very serious about it here. It's one of the things that we feel as an airport operator, we can control, and we expect compliance.
Right, right. We have a lot of questions also about medium and long-term strategy and adaptations to the new normal. So let me try to sort through some of them. One is concerning the planning for future similar situations, right? I think years ago, I mean, we talk a lot about external environmental analysis and scenario planning, but who would have thought that a pandemic of this magnitude would ever hit us, right? So for future planning, are you thinking about events like that in the travel industry, especially airports?
You know, yes, I think the event that we're in was certainly never contemplated in the way that airports contemplate many types of emergencies, and much more imaginable emergencies around, you know, aircraft accidents and a mass shooter and earthquakes, and you know, at some point now what seemed like almost a garden variety type of emergency, that we have detailed binders with plans and who does what and where is this thing and how do we coordinate with that agency. Most airports do not have the depth of planning around pandemics, short of maybe what I would say is more epidemic procedures. Hey, if a flight to and from a given country that has an outbreak, here's the types of things you might do on a very localized level, but under the guidance of federal and state organizations. The scale and magnitude of this has never been seen before. Therefore, the plans didn't match the event in that sense. And the plans that were in place, they were overcome by magnitude soon thereafter. So yes, I think there's going to be more of a focus on that. And it kind of comes in those two buckets. You know, how do you adapt your operation in the realm of your safety and security and utilization of your facilities? You know, we've got 7 parking garages here and more parking lots than I can count. And you know, half of those are completely empty. So what is the next time this happens? What are we going to do differently with those? One of them now is being evaluated as a vaccination site and will likely become one. So those dormant assets may have a purpose, but the thinking around future proofing our finances is an interesting question as well, given that, you know, an airport that has been growing year after year at a, you know, average rate between on a slow year, maybe just under 4%, and as times, you know, 5% plus, and the capital investment that we're continually doing to keep up with that growth, and now we've gone over the cliff. Well, how do you calibrate a capital program to future economic shocks? It's a great question.
Right. And you know, in that regard, there are also conversations over what the future airport may look like. There are some related questions in the chat also about unmanned aerial vehicles,
Mm-hmm.
about ride sharing in the air travel industry. So how is that all going to impact the airport of the future?
Yeah, great questions. You know, going back to health and aviation, I think just as 9/11 was a watershed moment for aviation security, physical security, I think without a doubt, this will be the watershed moment in the idea that health as an element of security, both for the individual, for economic security, will become a focus that aviation has to adapt into. And you know, given that viruses don't float in the air around the world, they attach to a person typically and move. Aviation moves people to more places faster than anything. We're certainly a part of the problem, but we'll be a part of the solution. How that standardization occurs, I think, is probably one of the most challenging pieces, just given that when you think about international coordination around aviation, you've got a very, very broad set of stakeholders in countries with all sorts of different capabilities and concerns and issues, that as you try and standardize that in a country that has a much a much less developed healthcare system or other types of infrastructure that would be needed around health requirements for international travel, it will be a challenge. Unlike physical security, where you can buy different types of scanners and screeners and have people scanning physically for security and doing background checks and all sorts of things. Health is a very different matter. So there will be big challenges there. The airport of the future, I think if you go back to what were we thinking about, a year ago, aviation had reached all new levels of growth and prosperity and opportunity. And one of the many pieces on the table in that bold future was urban air mobility, which is this idea of being able to fly at low altitudes and initially, probably a manned vehicle, but ultimately unmanned type of urban air taxi. And as congestion has been a major component of a lot of urban areas, this was seen as kind of this next measure of harvesting airspace in that low altitude level for both passenger and cargo, with technology that is very viable. And I believe there is a role for that to play in an airport of our size. It's not entirely clear what that is yet, because the technologies are still in various levels of readiness. But if you had to imagine at San Francisco, where we have a central garage that you walk out of our main terminals, and today we actually have Uber and Lyft in cars on the roof of that garage doing our staging for pickups. Could you imagine someday that has vertical takeoff and landing space for air taxis? It's very possible. It certainly comes with some challenges around how the FAA views the airspace and what traditionally has been thought of as the way those facilities function on airports. But I believe there's a very bold future for aviation. If you think about the experiment we've all had in mass telecommuting and for some of the wonderful things we've all learned that you can enjoy in working from home, there's a whole lot we're all missing. And whether that's at the office or visiting a client in Asia or going to a conference in New York or wherever you need to go to be physically present, and aviation will be the only way that is viable going forward.
Right. Do you think in that regard, with changing technology, that the age of the A380 super jet is over? Will it come back? Will it come back to SFO specifically?
Yeah, one of the outcomes of this event has been carriers abandoning a lot of the very large aircraft, the 747s, end of life reasons for that too. But the A380, a very new airplane in many cases, but very, very large, a lot of seats to fill. And if you run the economics of any particular flight, you often combine elements of distance and cost per mile, and then what is your revenue per available seat that you have to start generating to cover that. And as you move a lot of seats a long distance, that number goes way up. And unless it's a really efficient airplane, you stand to lose a lot of money operating really big airplanes over long distances with empty seats. And so the market, when you look at something like the 787, that is much, much smaller and has extremely efficient operational characteristics and therefore lower costs, markets that are served by the 787 and could maybe take 2 a day instead of one really large airplane, they get better service levels with more frequency and less risk to the airline and a great passenger experience. Most folks don't embrace getting on a massive airplane. It can degrade the experience in different ways. So I think there will still be a role for those to play, but at a much, much smaller level initially. And then I think we have to see where it goes from there. You're still going to have to move volumes of people long distances, but those aircraft were we're not even the preferred airplane at times in a really, really healthy environment. And it'll be interesting to see in recovery the few airlines that are still maintaining those aircraft in their fleet, what they decide to do with them.
So I guess in the near term, it'll also depend on how passenger volumes develop, right? So how do you see that? Now we have a testing mandate, right, for international travel. How is that going to change passenger volume? We may have a vaccination mandate. How will that change? And how do you see travel bouncing back in Europe?
So a couple of observations on that. One is that the airlines have they do share with us information about advanced bookings to help us look at our operational volumes ahead of time. And one of the things that has happened with a lot of the changes in the provisions around flexibility within your ticket, you can cancel it, you can reschedule it, is that those advanced bookings are much less reliable indicators now. Because the ticket that was purchased in March may get pushed to July, and so you're just seeing a lot of movement in that projected volume. So it makes it less reliable. You know, if you look at our November numbers from this year, we put just over 1 million people through the facility here, and we would have been closer to 5 million previously. If we think about 2020, you know, one of our questions as we forecast for calendar year 21 and have built our forecast is, will we achieve our 2020 number? Because in 2020, we had a couple of good, strong months at the beginning of the year. And so with any luck, the end of 21 by, you know, mid to late summer, we're really starting to see some turnaround. But the initial data we've seen just from the deployment of vaccinations is that traveler confidence and sentiment has not returned in robust bookings because, you know, hey, vaccinations are out there. I know I'm going to get one. I'm going to go ahead and start booking. We're actually seeing just the opposite. We're actually seeing an erosion in bookings. January is a pretty slow month typically for travel. January, February is usually two of the slowest months of the year. So not entirely surprising, but at the same time, we're just not seeing the confidence here out of the gate with the news about vaccines and our travelers really starting to make plans because of that.
And did you see a shift towards, especially among the business travelers, towards more private planes, jet sharing, and so on?
You know, here in San Luis Obispo, yes, because that traffic was a much bigger component of the overall traffic on the airport. At an airport like San Francisco, it's such a small component that you don't see a visible shift. Within the overall markets, yes, I think there has been an uplift in the use of business aircraft for certain purposes for certain companies, but not to the extent that you're moving a lot of people, a lot of places within that network. So, you know, those aircraft will, I think always be an important tool for certain companies, but you know, you haven't seen really. There's only so many airplanes in that fleet, and they can only do so many flights.
Right. And what about freight volumes? Have those stayed constant? Increased?
We've seen an upturn here, not to the extent that airports that have I would call them large scale dedicated cargo hub facilities where you're hubbing a FedEx or a UPS operation out of those. We have a fairly large facility here, but proportional to the size of the airport, it's not as big as what you might see at some of the mid-continent hubs where you have hubbing out of. But yeah, we've seen those volumes go up commensurately, as well as the use of the belly cargo in the aircraft as well.
Kevin, we have a few more questions in the chat, and we won't get to all of them. If somebody has a specific question, may I just suggest that they email us and that we relay the questions to you? Is that okay?
Sure.
Then let me just end on one question, which is, we're talking a lot about the negative impacts, right, of the current pandemic. Are there some positives that you are taking away from the experience of the last few months, personally, but also, of course, professionally from an airport perspective?
Yes, there certainly are, and I think it's been an important time for organizations to really look internally at what matters, what's important, how we do business, why we do things the way we do. For a really simple example of that is the attachment to legacy processes around in some cases we have contracts and permits that are inches thick, and we have a very analog process here in San Francisco in some cases that has transformed in a matter of months and weeks into a digital process for things that short of this event forcing that would have probably taken a lot longer and been a lot harder to implement. But I think there has been opportunity for process change. I think there's been an opportunity for evaluation of priority of certain aspects of the airport. Those will carry into the future in ways that are yet to be seen. But I think we will come out of this transformed, and in that, government isn't always transformable. And I always like to think of the airport as this beast, that on the one hand is government, but on the other hand we're private sector, and yet we're kind of given this mandate of produce a private sector result under the construct of government, and that's a really big lift. And so my hope is that in that transformation we come out more agile, in some cases more lean, a much better understanding of the internal workings of our operation, and that as we return to growth, we grow smarter. We really think about what happens when a major event happens, and in a place like San Francisco, it could be an earthquake, right? If we had a major earthquake here that took one of our runways offline, which is a very foreseeable, real potential scenario because of a major fracture in a runway, well, how do we operate the airport when we're 50% limited on a single departure runway? And what is the impact of that? Well, we've kind of seen that in some sense right now. So I think from a resiliency standpoint, we'll be able to have a better way to stress test things. And, I think the lesson in this is never fail to imagine. I think there could be a cottage industry of fourth graders walking into boardrooms and creating the scariest scenario for a company to try and adapt to, that once upon a time people might have said that's nonsense. But I mean, look at the last year, and how many things can you line up that start to just create this this completely composite event that's almost unimaginable.
Yeah. Could not agree more. So Kevin, thank you so much for being with us today. I wish all of us that we bounce back very soon, and that you will be at capacity again at San Francisco International Airport.
Thank you.
We thank you for participating in today's Forward Together webinar series, brought to you by the School of Management at California Lutheran University. The School of Management offers a broad range of programs and community services. Whether you're looking to upgrade your career, locate current economic data from our Center for Economic Research and Forecasting, or a place to start and grow your business at Hub 101, our community startup space, we invite you to visit us at clu.edu/SOM and join the community as we move forward together.